The silence was what struck Margaret first when she emerged from her cottage. On that May morning in 1350, the absolute absence of the sounds that had always marked the beginning of a day in the village of Ashton, no rooster crowing from the yard beside the church, no voices calling greetings across the common green, no cattle lowing as they were driven to pasture, no children laughing or crying or playing in the dusty lane, no clatter of tools from the blacksmith's forge, no creak of cart wheels or thud of hooves on the packed earth, nothing but the wind moving through the empty houses and the distant cawing of crows in the fields beyond the village, and the terrible knowledge that of the 200 souls who had lived in this corner of England just 6 months earlier. Barely 30 remained alive, the rest taken by the pestilence that had swept through the parish like the angel of death, sparing some for reasons no one could understand, while claiming others with a randomness that mocked every attempt to find meaning or justice in the catastrophe. Margaret stood in her doorway, 24 years old, widowed and childless, one of the survivors who now faced the prospect of rebuilding a life in a world that had been emptied of almost everyone and everything she had known, a world where the familiar routines and relationships and certainties had been swept away, leaving behind only these silent streets and abandoned cottages and the overwhelming question of how to continue when continuation seemed almost impossible, and when the very purpose of surviving felt unclear in the absence of the community that had given meaning to existence. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The village of Ashton had been a typical English agricultural settlement. Before the plague came a cluster of timber-framed cottages arranged around a central green, with the stone church of St. Mary standing at one end and the manor house on a slight rise at the other, surrounded by the open fields where the villagers worked their strips of land, the common meadows where they grazed their animals, the woodlots where they gathered fuel and timber, and the mill stream that powered the Lord's mill and provided water for the livestock. The village had existed in this form for at least 3 centuries, probably longer, its patterns of life and work, established by generations of villagers who had been born and lived and died within a radius of perhaps 10 miles, rarely traveling farther, rarely seeing anything beyond the familiar landscape of field and forest and stream that constituted their entire world. The villagers had been a mix of villains who held their land from the Lord in exchange for labor service, freemen who owned their own land, cotters who had only small plots and who worked as laborers for others, and the few craftsmen, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the alewife whose skills served the community's needs. It had been a world of known faces and established relationships, of traditions that stretched back beyond memory, of routines that changed with the seasons, but that followed patterns so ancient and so familiar that they seemed as permanent as the land itself. Everyone knew everyone else, knew their families and their histories and their secrets, knew who could be trusted and who required watching, knew the complex web of debts and favors and obligations that bound the community together. Marriages were arranged between families who had known each other for generations. Children grew up playing with the same companions they would work alongside as adults. Old people died surrounded by family and neighbors who had known them all their lives. The rhythm of the agricultural year governed everything, plowing and planting in spring, tending and weeding in summer. harvesting in autumn, threshing and preparing for winter in the cold months, the cycle repeating endlessly, year after year, generation after generation. The church had been the spiritual and social center of village life its bells, marking the hours and calling the faithful to prayer, its calendar of feast days and holy days providing structure to the year and occasions for celebration and community gathering. Father Thomas, who had served the parish for more than 20 years, had been a constant presence, baptizing the newborn, marrying the young couples, burying the dead, hearing confessions, celebrating Mass every Sunday, and on holy days visiting the sick, blessing the fields at planting time, offering counsel and comfort and correction as needed. He had been learned by village standards, able to read Latin and to explain the Scriptures, though his theology was probably not particularly sophisticated by the standards of university-trained clerics. But he had been devoted to his flock, had lived simply and modestly, sharing the poverty and the struggles of his parishioners, and he had been loved and respected in return. The manor Lord Sir William had been a more distant figure, occupying a different social sphere, but he had been part of the village fabric nonetheless, presiding over the manorial court that settled disputes and enforced the customs of the manor, collecting his rents and his labor services, but also providing protection and maintaining the mill and managing the commons and performing the various functions that a lord was expected to fulfill. Sir William had been neither particularly generous nor particularly harsh, neither especially beloved nor particularly hated, simply a fixture of village life, occupying the position that his father and grandfather had occupied before him, maintaining the social order that everyone understood and generally accepted as natural and proper. Then, in the autumn of 1349, a traveller had arrived in the village, a merchant who had been to Bristol, and who carried with him not just the goods he hoped to sell, but also the seeds of the great mortality that was sweeping across England. The merchant's name had been John Fletcher, and Margaret remembered him clearly, a man of perhaps 40, well-dressed for a traveling merchant, riding a decent horse and leading a pack animal loaded with bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. He had stopped at the alehouse to take refreshment and to display his wares to anyone interested in purchasing, and several of the villagers had gathered to see what he had brought: cloth from Flanders, small tools and implements, ribbons and thread, salt and spices, the sorts of goods that village craftsmen could not produce and that had to be purchased from outside. Fletcher had seemed healthy when he arrived, had spent several hours in the village talking and trading, had eaten and drunk at the alehouse, had even stayed the night, sleeping in the loft above the common room. But the next morning he had complained of feeling unwell, had spoken of aches in his limbs and a terrible headache, had said he thought perhaps he had eaten something that disagreed with him. By midday he was clearly seriously ill, feverish and weak, unable to continue his journey. The alewife, a widow named Joan, had allowed him to remain in her loft, had brought him water and broth, had tried to make him comfortable while he burned with fever and cried out in delirium. Within 2 days the swellings had appeared, great painful buboes in Fletcher's neck and armpits and groin, swellings that grew to the size of eggs and that seemed to throb with their own terrible life. The smell from the sick man became overwhelming, a sweet, rotten stench that made people gag when they came near. His skin developed dark blotches, patches of discoloration that looked like bruises but that were actually internal bleeding, making itself visible. The fever continued to rage, and Fletcher in his delirium screamed about demons and darkness about burning and drowning, about his dead wife and children, who he said were calling to him from the grave. On the third day after his illness began, John Fletcher died. His body, swollen and discolored and reeking, was hastily wrapped in a sheet and buried in a grave dug at the edge of the village far from the consecrated ground of the churchyard. For there was fear that the disease that had killed him might somehow contaminate holy ground, or might spread from his corpse to others if he was buried near where people would continue to walk and pray. Father Thomas said prayers over the grave, commending Fletcher's soul to God's mercy, but he too seemed uneasy, seemed to sense that this death was somehow different from the normal deaths he had presided over in his years as parish priest. The villagers hoped desperately that Fletcher's death would be the end of it, that whatever disease had killed him had died with him. But within a week the alewife Joan fell ill with the same symptoms: fever, terrible headache, the swellings, the dark patches on the skin, the overwhelming stench. And then others who had been in contact with Fletcher or with Joan also fell ill. The blacksmith's wife, who had purchased ribbon from Fletcher, a young man who had helped carry Fletcher's body to its grave, Joan's daughter, who had nursed her mother. The disease spread with terrifying speed, seeming to leap from person to person through contact or even through proximity. Though no one understood the mechanism of transmission, and theories varied wildly. Some said it was spread by bad air, others by the evil eye, others by God's judgment on sin, others by malign conjunctions of the planets, others by poisoning of wells by enemies or by demons. Within a month, more than half the village was infected. The symptoms were unmistakable, and the course of the disease was almost always the same: fever and pain, the appearance of the buboes, the skin discoloration, delirium, and then death, usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. Some few survived, the buboes breaking and draining foul-smelling pus, the fever breaking, the patient gradually recovering, though often left weakened and scarred. But most died, and the death rate was so high and the spread so rapid that the village was soon overwhelmed. Father Thomas worked tirelessly in those first weeks, visiting the sick, administering last rites, trying to provide comfort and spiritual support to people who were dying in agony and terror. He organized the healthy villagers to help nurse the sick and to dig the graves that were needed in increasing numbers. He led prayers and processions, asking God to lift the plague from the village, organizing acts of penance and devotion in the hope that divine mercy might be won through proper observance. But the plague continued unabated, and then Father Thomas himself fell ill, and within 3 days he was dead, dying without the last rites he had given to so many others, buried hastily in the churchyard by villagers too frightened and too overwhelmed to give him the elaborate funeral his position warranted. With the priest dead, the social and spiritual center of the village collapsed. There was no one to celebrate Mass, no one to perform baptisms or marriages or burials with proper ceremony. No one to provide the spiritual leadership that medieval Christianity required and that the villagers desperately needed in their time of crisis. Some villagers turned to private prayer and devotion, spending hours on their knees begging God for deliverance. Others turned to superstition and folk remedies, trying charms and potions and rituals that had nothing to do with Christian teaching, but that offered at least the illusion of taking action against the invisible enemy that was destroying their community. The social structure of the village began to break down as the plague intensified. Normal work became impossible when so many were sick and when the healthy were terrified of contact, with others who might carry the disease. The fields that should have been harvested in autumn were left to rot, for there were not enough healthy workers, and those who remained were too frightened or too demoralized to organize the harvest. Animals went untended, some dying for lack of care, others escaping and running wild. The mill stopped operating when the miller and his entire family died. The blacksmith's forge went cold when he fell ill and died, his sons having already succumbed. Normal social interactions ceased. People avoided their neighbors, fearing that any contact might bring infection. Families quarantined themselves in their cottages, refusing to open their doors even to old friends. Some of the sick were abandoned by their own families, left alone to die in houses that were then sealed and avoided. Other families stayed together through the illness, nursing their sick with devoted care, and often entire households died within days of each other, parents and children all succumbing to the disease and lying dead together in cottages that were discovered only when the smell became overpowering. Margaret's own experience of the plague was seared into her memory with a clarity and detail that would never fade, no matter how many years passed. Her husband John had been a carpenter, a skilled craftsman of 30 years, strong and healthy and vigorous. They had been married for 2 years, had been working to establish their household, had been planning to start a family in the coming year. John had been careful during the early weeks of the plague, avoiding contact with the sick, staying away from the alehouse and other gathering places, focusing on his work and on their household. For a while it seemed that this caution might protect them, that they might be among those who somehow escaped the disease. But in late October, John came home from a job at the manor house, complaining of feeling unwell. Margaret tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that he was simply tired or had eaten something that disagreed with him, that the headache and the aches he described were ordinary ailments that would pass with rest. But by evening he was burning with fever, his skin hot and dry to the touch, his eyes bright with a fevered glitter that terrified. Margaret, even as she tried to hide her fear and to be strong for him, by the next morning the first buboes had appeared, swellings in John's armpits that were exquisitely painful to the touch, that made him cry out when Margaret tried to examine them. She had seen enough plague victims by this point to know what these swellings meant, to know that John was almost certainly going to die, that there was nothing she could do to save him, that she could only try to make him comfortable and stay with him through the ordeal that lay ahead. She did not leave his side for the next 3 days, sponging his feverish body with cool water, trying to get him to drink, though he could, barely swallow holding him when he thrashed in delirium, speaking softly to him when he was lucid enough to hear, praying constantly for a miracle that she knew in her heart would not come. John's decline was agonizing to witness. The strong, capable man who had been her husband and her partner and her protector became a suffering creature who barely seemed human, his body swollen and discolored, his breath coming in rasping gasps, his eyes rolling in delirium, his voice when he could speak reduced to meaningless, babbling or to terrible screams of pain and fear. The buboes grew larger, some of them breaking open and releasing streams of foul-smelling pus that Margaret cleaned away as best she could, though the smell made her gag, and the sight of her husband's suffering nearly broke her heart. The dark patches on his skin spread, covering his chest and his back, looking like great bruises, evidence of the disease destroying his body from within. On the 3rd day, John died. Margaret was holding his hand when his breathing, which had been labored and irregular for hours, simply stopped There was no dramatic moment, no final words, no peaceful passing into death. He simply stopped breathing, his body relaxing slightly, the fevered tension draining away, leaving behind only an empty shell that looked like John, but that was clearly no longer inhabited by the person she had loved. Margaret sat with the body for a long time, unable to quite believe that it was over, that her husband was gone, that she was now alone. She wept, finally allowing herself the tears she had held back during the days of nursing, crying for John and for herself, and for the future they would never have, and for the complete unfairness and randomness of a disease that took good people and left them dead for no reason that anyone could understand. Eventually Margaret roused herself enough to prepare John's body for burial as best she could, washing him and wrapping him in a clean sheet, though she knew that there would be no proper funeral, no elaborate ceremony, probably not even a marked grave, for the churchyard was rapidly filling, and the normal burial practices had been abandoned in the desperate rush to dispose of the dead before their bodies corrupted completely. She managed to find 2 men who were still healthy enough to help carry the body, and they buried John in the churchyard in a grave that was marked only with a simple wooden cross. No stone monument, no inscription, nothing but the cross in Margaret's memory to mark where he lay. After the burial, Margaret returned to her cottage and waited for the disease to strike her. She had been in constant contact with John through his illness, had touched his fevered body and cleaned his sores and breathed the same air. She had seen countless examples of the plague spreading through families, taking everyone in a household within days. She expected to fall ill herself, almost welcomed the prospect, for death seemed preferable to the loneliness and grief of survival. But days passed, then weeks, and she remained healthy. The fever did not come, the buboes did not appear, and gradually Margaret had to accept that for whatever mysterious reason, she had been spared, that she was going to survive when her husband and so many others had died. The plague continued to rage through the village through November and into December, claiming more victims with each passing week, showing no signs of abating, no pattern that might allow prediction or prevention. By Christmas, the village that had once housed 200 people was reduced to perhaps 50 survivors, and the disease was still spreading. The traditional Christmas celebrations were impossible. There was no priest to celebrate Mass, no community spirit left for feasting, too much grief and fear for any kind of joy. A few villagers gathered at the church on Christmas Day and said prayers together, led by old Thomas, who was one of the few members of the older generation to survive. But it was a grim and desperate ceremony, nothing like the joyful celebrations of years past. The new year brought no relief. January saw more deaths. February saw more deaths. March saw more deaths, though the rate was slowing as there were simply fewer people left to sicken. Some of these later deaths were from the plague itself, but some were from other causes, starvation, as food supplies ran out, cold, and the harsh winter without adequate fuel or shelter, violence as desperate people fought over resources, simple despair, and the loss of the will to live. The village was collapsing not just from the direct effects of the disease, but from the complete breakdown of the social and economic systems that had sustained life. And then, finally, in late March, the plague stopped. There were no new cases. The last victims either died or recovered, and the survivors emerged into a world transformed. Of the 200 people who had lived in Ashton before the plague, only 32 remained alive. Entire families had been extinguished, the miller and his wife and all their children, the baker and his family, multiple households of villains and cotters, the lord and his immediate family. Some families had partial survivors, old Thomas, who had lost his wife and all but one of his 4 children, the blacksmith who had lost his wife but whose 2 sons had survived, young widow Anne, whose husband and infant child had both died, but who had herself recovered from the disease, though it had left her scarred and weakened. Margaret stood in her doorway on that May morning in 1350 and surveyed the village she had known all her life, and it seemed like a place from a dream or a nightmare, familiar in its physical form, but utterly changed in its essence. The cottage where the miller had lived stood empty, its door hanging open, weeds already growing in the garden that his wife had tended so carefully. The baker's shop was cold and dark, the ovens that had produced bread for the entire village now silent and useless. The house where Alice the alewife had run her business was abandoned, the barrels of ale she had been brewing when the plague struck still sitting in her cellar, slowly turning to vinegar. Everywhere Margaret looked, she saw absence cottages without people, gardens without gardeners, workshops without craftsmen, a village without the life that had filled it for centuries. The physical decay was already evident. Thatched roofs that needed annual maintenance were beginning to sag and leak. Gardens that had been carefully tended were overgrown with weeds. Fences that had marked property boundaries were broken or fallen. Animals that had escaped from their pens had trampled through the village, knocking down walls and destroying what order remained. The church stood with its door barred, for without a priest there was no one to hold services, and the building seemed more like a tomb than a house of worship. The manor house on the hill was empty and silent, its windows dark, its courtyard filled with leaves and debris, but the silence was perhaps more disturbing than the physical decay. Margaret had grown up with the constant background noise of a functioning village voices calling, children playing, animals making their various sounds, tools striking and scraping and sawing, wheels creaking, doors banging, the general hum of human activity. Now there was almost nothing, just the wind, the distant crows, occasionally a voice from one of the inhabited cottages, the sound so startling in the silence that it seemed almost like a violation. The village had become a place of ghosts, and the living who remained seemed almost like ghosts themselves, moving quietly through the empty streets, speaking in hushed voices, unable quite to believe the magnitude of what had happened. Margaret forced herself to begin the tasks that survival required, even though the purpose of survival felt unclear when so much had been lost. She drew water from the village well, noting as she did that the bucket and rope were fraying and would need replacement soon, adding that to the growing mental list of tasks that needed attention, but that there was no one to perform. She fed the chickens that had survived in her coop, gathered their eggs, scattered grain from her diminishing supply. She milked the cow that had once belonged to her neighbor, William, and his family, all of whom were dead, the cow having wandered homeless until Margaret had taken it in, knowing that letting a productive animal go to waste would be foolish regardless of technical questions of ownership that seemed irrelevant in the current circumstances. As she worked through these familiar tasks, Margaret's mind grappled with larger questions about the future. How could the village continue to function with so few people? How would the fields be worked when there were barely enough survivors to cultivate even a fraction of the land that had been under the plow before the plague? Who would perform the specialized tasks that kept a village operating, milling grain, shoeing horses, making tools, brewing ale, all the crafts and skills that had been distributed among villagers who were now dead? What would happen when the next crisis came? A bad harvest, a harsh winter, a raid by outlaws, when the village had so few people and such limited resources to deal with emergencies? And beyond these practical questions were deeper ones about meaning and purpose. Why had God allowed this to happen? What sin could possibly warrant punishment on such a scale? Why had some survived while others died, when the patterns seemed completely random, and when the survivors were no more virtuous or pious than those who had died? Was this the end of the world, the apocalypse that the Bible prophesied, or was it simply a terrible disaster from which recovery might somehow be possible? Should the survivors stay in Ashton and try to rebuild, or should they abandon the village and seek new lives elsewhere, in places that perhaps had not been struck so hard by the plague? These questions had no clear answers, and different survivors approached them differently. Some, like old Thomas, were determined to stay and to rebuild, to honor the memory of the dead by maintaining the village and the community that had been home to generations of their families. Others were planning to leave, to seek opportunities elsewhere, to escape from the place that held so many painful memories. Still others were simply paralyzed by grief and uncertainty, unable to make decisions or plan for a future that seemed impossibly difficult and uncertain. Margaret herself felt torn between impulses. Part of her wanted to flee, to leave Ashton and all its memories behind, to start fresh in some other place where she would not be constantly reminded of loss. But another part of her felt bound to the village, felt that leaving would be a betrayal of John and of all the others who had died, felt that her duty was to stay and to help rebuild what had been destroyed. She had no clear answer to this dilemma, and for the moment she simply continued with the daily tasks of survival, putting off larger decisions until she felt more capable of making them. As the morning progressed, Margaret saw other survivors emerging from their cottages to begin their own day's work. Old Thomas came out, stooped with age but still determined, heading toward the fields with tools over his shoulder. The blacksmith, Robert, opened his forge, and soon the sound of his hammer rang through the village, a small note of normalcy in the pervading silence. Young Anne appeared at her cottage door with her water bucket, saw Margaret, and waved across the green, a small gesture of acknowledgment and solidarity between two widows who had survived when so many had not. Margaret decided to walk through the village, something she had begun doing every few days, checking on the empty cottages, looking for signs of deterioration or damage, occasionally salvaging something useful, a tool, a piece of furniture, stored food that had not yet spoiled, items that the dead no longer needed and that the living could use. This salvaging felt uncomfortable, almost like theft, for these had been her neighbors' possessions, things they had worked for and valued. But the alternative was to let valuable resources rot and decay while the living lacked necessities, and pragmatism had to outweigh sentiment when survival was at stake. She began her circuit at the cottage that had belonged to Richard the baker and his wife Emma and their 3 children. The family had all died within a week of each other in November, and the cottage had stood empty since then. Margaret pushed open the door, which creaked on its leather hinges, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the shutters being closed, and the air was stale and musty, with an underlying smell of decay that made Margaret's stomach turn. Mice or rats had clearly been active. She could see their droppings on the floor and their gnaw marks on wooden objects. The cottage was a typical peasant dwelling, a single large room with a sleeping loft above, a central hearth for cooking and heating, and sparse furnishings, a table, a few stools, a chest for storage, some cooking pots and tools. The baker's professional equipment, the kneading troughs and the wooden peel for the oven and the measuring containers stood unused and gathering dust. Margaret had no use for these specialized items. She baked her own bread, but not for sale to others. But she made a mental note of their location in case someone in the village decided to take up baking professionally. What she did need were more practical items. She found a good iron cooking pot, larger and better made than her own, and she took it, knowing that Emma would have understood the need and would not have begrudged her the use of it. She found some wool blankets in the storage chest, and these too she took, for blankets were valuable and her own were wearing thin. She found a basket that was still serviceable and some wooden bowls that could be used. She found in a small wooden box some silver pennies, not a great sum, but more money than the baker's family would have had for everyday use, probably savings being set aside for some future purpose that would never come. Margaret hesitated over the coins, for taking them felt more like theft than taking the practical household items, but she finally took them too, reasoning that they could be used to purchase things the village needed, and that leaving them here served no purpose. In the sleeping loft, Margaret found the children's belongings, small clothes, simple toys, a rag doll that had been loved into shapelessness. This was the hardest part of these salvaging expeditions, encountering the personal possessions of people she had known, objects that spoke of lives that had been lived and had been cut short, especially the children's things that spoke of innocence and play and futures that would never be realized. Margaret had to steel herself against the emotions these discoveries provoked, had to remind herself that grief, however natural and appropriate, could not be allowed to paralyze her, that the dead were beyond help, and that her duty was to the living. She left the cottage with her salvaged items and continued her circuit. The next cottage had belonged to William, the villain, and his wife Sarah, and their 5 children. This family, too, had been completely extinguished, though their deaths had been spread over several weeks, the children dying first, then Sarah, then finally William, who had lingered for weeks after his wife's death, too grief-stricken and despairing to really fight for survival. Their cottage was in worse condition than the baker's, for William, in his final weeks, had let everything go, had not bothered to maintain the building, or to clean, or to do any of the normal tasks of household management. The door was broken, hanging from one hinge, and the interior was chaos, with possessions scattered everywhere, as if William had been searching frantically for something and had abandoned the search halfway through. Margaret did not linger here. The cottage was too disturbed, too obviously the scene of profound psychological breakdown, and she found it distressing to see the evidence of William's final days. She took only a few items that were immediately useful, some tools, a length of good rope, and then left, closing the broken door as best she could behind her. As she walked, Margaret noticed changes in the natural world around the village. The gardens that had been carefully tended before the plague were now overgrown jungles of weeds and volunteer plants. The herbs and vegetables that had been planted were still growing, but were being choked by the aggressive weeds that had been kept under control when there were gardeners to weed regularly. Some useful plants would survive on their own. The onions and leeks were hardy. Some of the herbs, like rosemary and thyme, were tough enough to compete with weeds, but the more delicate vegetables were being overwhelmed. The fields beyond the village were also changing. The strips of land that individual families had worked in the open field system were losing their clear boundaries as weeds and grass invaded from the unplowed margins. The winter wheat that should have been harvested the previous autumn had matured and fallen, and now the grain was rotting on the ground or being eaten by birds and mice. Some strips had been grazed by the cattle and sheep that had escaped and gone feral, the animals trampling and eating whatever they found. The whole agricultural landscape that had been so carefully managed for centuries was beginning to revert to something more wild and natural, though the process would take years to complete. Margaret returned to her cottage in the early afternoon, carrying her salvaged items, and she spent time organizing them, adding the pot and blankets and other goods to her own household stores, hiding the coins in a small cloth bag that she kept concealed in the thatch of her roof. She then turned to preparing her midday meal, cooking a pottage of dried peas and onions and a bit of bacon in her new pot. Bread made from flour she had ground herself using a hand quern, a laborious process, but necessary when the mill was not operating. The food was plain and simple, but it was adequate, and Margaret ate it with the gratitude of someone who knew that having enough to eat was not something to be taken for granted. After eating, Margaret sat outside her cottage, enjoying the spring sunshine, and she thought about the future. The immediate crisis of the plague had passed, the dying had stopped. The survivors had stabilized. People were beginning to think beyond simple day-to-day survival to longer-term questions of how to live in this changed world. One of the most pressing questions was about authority and governance. The old Lord Sir William was dead. His wife and children had fled to their other estates and had not returned. The bailiff who had managed the manor's affairs and enforced the Lord's rights was dead. Father Thomas, who had provided spiritual leadership, was dead. The village was essentially leaderless, and while this had not caused immediate problems during the worst of the plague, when everyone was, too, overwhelmed to think about governance, it was becoming an issue as people tried to make decisions about the common resources and the future. Some decisions were being made informally by consensus among the survivors. They had agreed, for instance, that the open fields closest to the village would be plowed and planted collectively, with each family contributing labor according to their ability and receiving a share of the harvest according to their contribution. This was a modification of the traditional system where each family worked their own strips, but it made sense given how few people there were and how much land was available. They had agreed that the cattle and sheep that had belonged to dead families would be considered common property for now, managed collectively until some proper authority could determine ownership. They had agreed to continue maintaining the church building, even without a priest, cleaning it and making minor repairs so that when a new priest was eventually appointed, he would have a proper place to conduct services. But there were other questions that were harder to resolve by informal consensus. What about the empty cottages? Should they be maintained or allowed to decay? What about the land that was not being cultivated? Should it be enclosed for pasture, allowed to revert to wilderness, held in reserve for future use? What about people from other villages who might want to come to Ashton and claim the empty holdings? Should they be welcomed or turned away? These questions required someone with authority to make binding decisions, but there was no one with clear authority in the leaderless village. Margaret was sitting outside thinking about these matters when she saw a group of riders approaching the village from the direction of the main road. Visitors were rare in these plague-stricken times. Most people avoided travel if they could, fearful of encountering the disease in unfamiliar places, and Margaret felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as she watched the riders come closer. There were perhaps half a dozen of them, mounted on good horses, dressed in the clothing of gentlemen rather than peasants, clearly people of some status and means. The riders made their way to the village green, and the lead rider, a young man of perhaps 30 years, dismounted and looked around at the empty village with an expression of shock and dismay. The other villagers, hearing the sound of horses, emerged from their cottages, and soon most of the 30-odd survivors were gathered on the green, eyeing the visitors with wariness and curiosity. The young man stepped forward and addressed them, introducing himself as Thomas Ashton, nephew of the late Sir William, and the new lord of the manor. Thomas Ashton looked around at the tiny group of survivors, clearly struggling to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen his uncle's estate. He asked questions about what had happened, about how many had died, about the current state of the village and the manor. The survivors answered as best they could, old Thomas taking the lead in speaking for the group, explaining about the plague and its devastating effects, about the months of death and terror, about the current situation where barely 30 people remained from a population of 200. Lord Thomas listened with what seemed like genuine concern and distress. He explained that he had been in London, where he was studying law, when he received news of his Uncle G's death. He had not been able to travel immediately because the plague had been raging in London as well, and travel had been dangerous and restricted. But now that the disease seemed to be abating, at least in some areas, he had come to take possession of the estates he had inherited, and to see what could be done to restore them to productivity. The conversation that followed was remarkable for its tone, which was less imperious and demanding than might have been expected from a lord addressing his peasants, and more consultative and practical. Thomas Ashton acknowledged that the traditional manorial system had been built on assumptions about population and labor that were no longer valid. With so few people remaining, it was impossible to work the land using the old methods of labor service and customary obligations. The survivors simply could not provide the labor that would have been owed to the lord under normal circumstances, and attempting to enforce those obligations would only drive people away to other manors where lords were being more flexible and accommodating. Thomas proposed instead a new arrangement. He would reduce the rents on the land to levels that reflected the current difficult circumstances. He would eliminate most of the labor service requirements, allowing villains to work their own land and to pay rent in cash or in kind rather than in obligatory labor. He would allow people to take up multiple holdings if they could work them, recognizing that, with so much empty land available, it made more sense to have that land in production, even if it meant individuals holding more than the traditional single-family plot. He would provide seed and tools from the manor stores to help people get started with planting, and he would establish a regular manorial court to settle disputes and to make decisions about common resources and other matters requiring collective action. These proposals were far more generous than the survivors had expected, and they suggested that Thomas Ashton, whatever his other qualities might be, was at least pragmatic enough to recognize that attempting to rule over an empty manor would benefit no one, that his own prosperity depended on the recovery and well-being of his tenants, that flexibility and accommodation were more useful than rigid insistence on traditional rights and obligations. Whether he would maintain this approach over time or whether he would revert to more typical lordly behavior once the immediate crisis passed remained to be seen, but for now his proposals offered hope that recovery might be possible under a system that was more favorable to the Survivors in the old system had been. The survivors discussed Thomas's proposals among themselves after the Lord and his party had departed to inspect the manor house and the surrounding lands. The consensus was generally positive. The terms he was offering were better than most had expected, better than what they were likely to get from any other lord, and staying in Ashton under these terms seemed preferable to the risks and uncertainties of trying to start over somewhere else. There were some who remained skeptical, who suspected that the generous terms would be withdrawn once the Lord felt more secure in his position, but most were willing to give Thomas Ashton the benefit of the doubt and to see how the new arrangement worked in practice. Over the following weeks and months, the village slowly began to adapt to the post-plague reality and to implement the new arrangements that Thomas Ashton had proposed. The spring planting, which had seemed almost impossible when Margaret had first surveyed the empty village, was accomplished through collective effort, with the survivors working together to plow and plant the fields that had been selected for cultivation. The work was hard, there were fewer hands to share the labor, and everyone had to do more than they would have done in the old days, but it was also strangely satisfying, giving people a sense of purpose and accomplishment, of feeling that they were building something rather than simply surviving from day to day. Margaret found herself taking on roles and responsibilities that would have been unthinkable before the plague. She joined the group that made decisions about which fields to plant and how to distribute the work, participating in discussions that would once have been reserved for male heads of households and for the Lord S officials. She helped organize the collective labor, using her knowledge of who was capable of what work and her diplomatic skills to mediate disputes and keep people working together. And she began to establish herself as the village's herbalist and healer, using knowledge she had learned from her mother and from observation and experience to treat injuries and illnesses, filling some of the gap left by the absence of a priest who would traditionally have had some medical knowledge in addition to his spiritual duties. The work of planting and early cultivation occupied much of the spring and early summer. The survivors focused their efforts on the fields closest to the village, the best land that would yield the most productive harvests, letting the more distant and less productive strips lie fallow or revert to meadow. This was a dramatic change from the pre-plague pattern, where every available piece of land had been cultivated to feed the large population, but it made sense given current circumstances where there was far more land than labor and where it was better to do a good job on a smaller area than to try to work everything and do it poorly. In addition to the collective work in the fields, each household maintained its own garden and livestock, producing vegetables and eggs and dairy products for household consumption. Margaret's garden became one of the most productive in the village. Her knowledge of plants and her careful attention to cultivation, yielding harvests of onions and leeks, and cabbages and herbs that supplemented her diet and that she could trade with neighbors for things she could not produce herself: meat from Robert the blacksmith who raised pigs, grain from old Thomas, who had more land under cultivation than he could use for his own consumption, tools and repairs from various craftsmen in exchange for healing services. As summer advanced and the crops grew in the fields, there was a cautious optimism among the survivors. The plague had not returned. There had been no new cases since March, and people were beginning to dare to hope that perhaps the worst was over, that the disease had burned itself out and would not strike again. The work of rebuilding was progressing, slowly but visibly, with empty cottages being either demolished for materials or assigned to newcomers who began trickling into the village. attracted by reports of available land and generous terms from the Lord. The village was not and would never again be what it had been before the plague, but it was beginning to be something viable, a functioning community that could sustain itself and that offered its members a livelihood and a place to belong. For Margaret personally, the months after the plague brought gradual healing alongside the ongoing grief. She would never stop missing John, would never stop wishing that he had survived, would never quite lose the sense of unfairness and loss that his death had created. But she found that she could function despite the grief, could work and plan and even occasionally laugh, could envision a future that might include satisfaction, if not happiness. She discovered capabilities in herself that she had not known existed: strength to endure what had seemed unendurable, resilience to recover from crushing loss, practical skills and intelligence that allowed her to make her way in the changed world. She also discovered that she had some choice about her future, a degree of autonomy that would never have been possible in the pre-plague world. As a villain's widow, Margaret would normally have been in a precarious position, expected to remarry quickly to someone who could work the land, or possibly forced to give up the holding and become a servant or dependent on relatives. But in the post-plague village, where labor was scarce and land was abundant, Margaret found that she could effectively claim independence. She had her cottage, she had land that she was working, she had her cow and her chickens and her garden, and she had skills brewing, healing, general competence in household management that made her valuable to the community. For the first time in her life, Margaret could imagine a future that she controlled, rather than one that was determined for her by father or husband or lord. This independence was both liberating and frightening. Margaret had been raised in a world where security came from being part of a household headed by a man, where a woman's role was clearly defined, and where stepping outside that role was dangerous and improper. The freedom to make her own choices came without the support structures and the guidance that had previously shaped her life. And there were times when she felt adrift, uncertain how to proceed, wishing that someone would simply tell her what to do. But increasingly, as the months passed, she found that she preferred autonomy to dependence, preferred making her own decisions, even when they were difficult, to having decisions made for her, preferred the risks of independence to the security of subordination. Not all the survivors adjusted as well as Margaret to the post-plague world. Some were broken by grief and loss, going through the motions of life but never really recovering the will to live. Some became bitter and angry, railing against God or fate or the injustice of a world that would allow such catastrophe. Some became withdrawn and isolated, unable or unwilling to connect with others after having seen so many they loved die. The village had its share of these damaged souls, people who had survived physically, but who were spiritually or emotionally destroyed, and their presence was a reminder that survival was not always the blessing it might seem, that living through such catastrophe came with costs that could not be measured in simple physical terms. But most of the survivors found ways to continue, to rebuild their lives, to create new routines and new relationships to replace what had been lost. Young widow Anne remarried to a man from a neighboring village who had also lost his spouse to the plague, and they established a joint household and began working land together, creating something new from their shared loss. Old Thomas took on an apprentice, a young man from another plague-devastated village who wanted to learn farming and who saw opportunity in Ashton's available land. Robert the blacksmith found that his skills were in even greater demand than before the plague, as tools broke and needed repair, and as the survivors took up additional land that required more equipment, and he prospered modestly and became one of the leading figures in the village, his forge and his skill making him essential to the community's recovery. The summer brought the first harvest since the plague, and while the harvest was smaller than in pre-plague, years reflecting the reduced area under cultivation and the inexperience of some of the workers, it was adequate to feed the survivors and to provide seed for the next year's planting. The harvest was accomplished communally, with all the able-bodied survivors working together to bring in the grain, and there was a genuine sense of accomplishment when the last sheaves were loaded onto carts and transported to the barns for storage. They had survived the plague, they had managed to plant and tend the crops, and now they had successfully harvested, completing the agricultural cycle and proving that the village could function and could sustain its population. To mark the harvest, the survivors held a feast on the village green, a pale shadow of the elaborate harvest celebrations of pre-plague years, but meaningful nonetheless. They slaughtered a pig and roasted it, baked bread from the new grain, drank ale that Margaret and another woman had brewed, and spent an evening eating and talking and trying to celebrate despite the absences that hung over everything. It was impossible not to remember the harvest feasts of the past, when the green had been crowded with people, when there had been music and dancing and genuine joy, when the community had been whole and intact. But it was also possible to appreciate what they had accomplished, to feel pride in having come through catastrophe and having rebuilt enough to produce a harvest, to feel hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over, and the future might offer something better than mere survival. As autumn progressed and the days grew shorter and cooler, the survivors prepared for winter with a thoroughness born of experience with how quickly things could go wrong. Firewood was gathered and stacked, far more than a household of 1 or 2 people would normally need, but stockpiled against the possibility of a harsh winter, or of being unable to gather more if snow came early. Food was preserved, vegetables were stored in root cellars, grain was carefully protected from moisture and vermin, meat was salted and smoked, apples from the orchards around the village were picked and stored, clothing was mended, and new garments were made from wool and flax that had been processed during the summer. For everyone knew that adequate clothing was essential to surviving winter, and that replacing garments that wore out would be difficult when the normal sources of supply had been disrupted by the plague. The village also received its first new priest in October, a young man named Father John, who had been ordained just before the plague, and who had survived the disease himself in his previous parish. Father John was perhaps 25 years old, earnest and devout, but clearly overwhelmed by the challenges of ministering to a plague-devastated parish. He had been sent by the bishop to fill one of the hundreds of vacant parishes across the diocese, and he arrived in Ashton with minimal resources and no experience of the particular challenges he would face. Margaret and the other survivors tried to help Father John settle into his role, explaining the village's history and current situation, showing him the church and the accommodations that had been prepared for him in the small cottage beside the church that had traditionally housed the priest, introducing him to the parishioners and their various needs and circumstances. Father John seemed genuinely compassionate and concerned for his flock, and he quickly established himself by resuming the regular celebration of Mass, by visiting the sick and elderly, by beginning the process of recording births and deaths and marriages in the parish register that had been neglected since Father Thomas's death. The resumption of regular masses was surprisingly important to the survivors' morale and sense of community. The church services provided structure to the week, provided a regular occasion for the community to gather, reconnected them to the larger framework of Christian belief and practice that had been such a central part of pre-plague life. When the villagers gathered for the first Mass that Father John celebrated, when they heard the familiar Latin words and participated in the ancient rituals, there was a sense of restoration, a feeling that some essential element of normality was returning, that they were reconnecting with traditions and beliefs that transcended the catastrophe, and that provided context and meaning to their survival. Winter came, and it was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold that tested the survivors' preparations and resilience. But they made it through, huddled in their cottages around their fires, rationing their food and fuel, venturing out only when necessary to tend animals or to fetch water or firewood, enduring the months of cold and darkness with the knowledge that spring would eventually come and that they had survived worse than a hard winter. There were some deaths during the winter. Old Thomas finally succumbed to a combination of age and a respiratory illness that his weakened body could not fight. One of the newcomers to the village died in an accident when a tree he was cutting fell on him. An infant born to young Anne and her new husband died after only a few days of life. But these were normal deaths, the kind of losses that every community experienced, not the overwhelming catastrophe of the plague year. And then spring returned, the snow melted, the days grew longer and warmer, and the cycle began again, plowing and planting, tending and hoping, working toward another harvest. This second growing season after the plague saw continued improvement in the village's situation. More newcomers arrived, attracted by the available land and the favorable terms that Lord Thomas continued to offer. More land was brought under cultivation. The herds and flocks that had been depleted by the plague and by the chaos of the immediate post-plague months were rebuilt through careful breeding and management. Buildings were repaired or rebuilt, tools were made or obtained. The village infrastructure was gradually restored. Margaret continued to play a central role in the village community, her brewing business expanding to the point where she was effectively the village alewife, her healing practice growing as more people came to trust her skills, her voice in village councils being respected and valued. And 2 years after John's death, she remarried, not from necessity or pressure, but from genuine choice. The blacksmith Robert, whose first wife had died in the plague, proposed marriage, and after careful consideration, Margaret accepted, seeing in Robert a partner rather than a master, seeing in the marriage an alliance of equals that could benefit both of them while allowing each to maintain some independence and autonomy. It was a practical marriage in many ways. Robert needed someone to manage his household, and Margaret benefited from the connection to his trade and his status in the community. But it was also a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection that had developed over the 2 years of working together to rebuild the village. They established a household that combined elements of both their previous lives, with Margaret keeping her cottage and her brewing business, while also taking on responsibilities in Robert's home, and Forge with Robert respecting her independence, while also providing the partnership and companionship that made life in the post-plague world less lonely and less frightening. The years that followed saw Ashton continue its recovery and adaptation. The village never returned to its pre-plague population. The empty cottages were never all reoccupied. The full extent of the fields was never again cultivated. The dense community of 200 people living in close proximity never reformed. But the village that emerged from the plague years was in its own way successful and viable. A community of perhaps 70 or 80 people by the end of the 1350s working the best land, producing adequate harvests, maintaining a functioning economy and a coherent social structure. The experience of the plague left permanent marks on English society and on the survivors like Margaret who lived through it. The catastrophic loss of life fundamentally altered the relationship between labor and land, between lords and peasants, between scarcity and abundance. The old feudal system, which had been built on assumptions about population density and labor availability, became increasingly untenable as peasants recognized their enhanced bargaining power and as lords were forced to make concessions to keep their lands in production. The peasants' revolt of 1381, which would shake England 3 decades after the plague, had its roots in these post-plague transformations in the expectations and aspirations that developed among common people who had seen the old order shattered and who had experienced, however briefly, the possibilities of a different kind of life. For Margaret personally, the plague was the defining event of her life, the catastrophe that destroyed the world she had known and that forced her to discover capabilities and strengths she had not known she possessed. She would live to old age, eventually seeing grandchildren and even great-grandchildren born in the village she had helped to rebuild. She would tell them stories of the plague years, wanting them to understand what had been lost and what had been endured, though she knew they could never really grasp what it had been like to live through those months of death and terror, to wake each morning uncertain whether you would survive the day, to watch helplessly as everyone you knew died around you, to face the empty streets and the silent houses, and the overwhelming question of whether to continue or to give up. But she would also tell them about resilience and recovery, about how people had found the strength to continue despite everything, about how communities had been rebuilt from almost nothing, about how life had gone on even when it seemed impossible that it could. She would tell them that the empty streets, which had seemed like the end of everything, had eventually filled again with new voices and new life, that the silence had been broken, that the village had endured. And she would tell them that surviving catastrophe, while it left scars that never fully healed, also revealed something important about human nature, the capacity to endure unendurable loss, the resilience to rebuild from ruins, the determination to continue even when the purpose of continuing was unclear, the stubborn insistence on life even in the face of overwhelming death. The plague had been a horror and a tragedy, had taken from Margaret and from millions of others almost everything they valued, had left wounds that time could ease, but never entirely heal. But it had also paradoxically created possibilities and opportunities that might never have existed without it, had forced people to question assumptions and structures that had seemed permanent, had opened space for new forms of community and new patterns of life. The world that emerged from the plague years was in many ways better for common people than the world that had existed before, less crowded, more prosperous, more flexible, offering more opportunity and more autonomy. This did not justify the catastrophe or make the losses acceptable, but it meant that from the devastation had come transformation, that the empty streets had eventually led not just to recovery but to renewal, that from the greatest catastrophe medieval Europe had known had emerged the possibility of a different and, in some ways, better world. Margaret died in 1391 at the age of 65, surrounded by family and friends in the village that she had helped to save and to rebuild. She was buried in the churchyard of St. Mary's, her grave marked with a simple stone that recorded her name and her years and nothing more, for elaborate monuments were not for people of her station. But her legacy lived on in the village that had survived in the children and grandchildren who carried forward the community she had helped to maintain, in the example she had set of resilience and capability and determination. The empty streets had filled again, the silence had been broken, and life, in all its complexity and difficulty and occasional beauty, had continued, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and to the possibility that even the worst catastrophes can be survived and overcome